They called them witches, heretics, daughters of the night. But hidden behind those fearful words, these women were the architects of some of the greatest castles in Europe. Imagine walking through a towering fortress, feeling the cool stone beneath your hand, not knowing that somewhere in the shadows of history, a woman's touch shaped every curve and corner. Their names have been erased from the records, their stories burned or buried. Yet if you listen closely enough, the truth still echoes among the stones. Every ancient hall, every carved gargoyle, every secret chamber holds a memory of those who dared to build when the world told them they could not. Now, let me ask you something. Imagine if your knowledge, your skills were seen as too dangerous for the world. What would you do? Would you hide what you know, or would you risk everything to share it? That's the dilemma these women faced. In a time when power was a double-edged sword and wisdom could be mistaken for sorcery. Some called them witches because they understood the secrets of the earth, how to choose the right stone and make it stand for centuries, how to mix mortar that would outlast generations, how to design arches that seemed impossible to the ordinary eye. To many, that kind of mastery looked like magic. But for these women, it was simply the art of building, passed down in whispers and hidden in plain sight. Did you know that in the 12th century, building castles was supposed to be a man's world? Yet, in secret, there were women leading bands of stoneworkers, guiding projects that would change the very face of kingdoms. Their tools were simple: a chisel, a measuring rod, a vision of something greater. Their courage was legendary, though rarely spoken of. So if you are someone who loves history, who feels the pull of ancient mysteries and wants to unravel the secrets behind the world's greatest empires, you are in the right place. Like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives and join us as we bring these forgotten stories back to life. Because the stones still remember, and it is time we listen. Picture this. The year is 1100 and something, and across Europe massive stone fortresses are rising from the earth like ancient giants awakening. The official story tells us that men built these castles, lords commanding armies of workers, master masons directing every chisel strike. But what if I told you that hidden in the shadows of history, there's another story entirely? Deep in monastery archives and forgotten noble records, researchers have uncovered something extraordinary. Documents that speak of women, not just helping with construction, but actually leading entire guilds of builders. These weren't random mentions either. We're talking about organized groups of female craftspeople who possessed knowledge that seemed almost supernatural to their contemporaries. Now you have to understand the world these women lived in. The church held immense power, and anything that challenged the natural order was seen as dangerous. When local priests couldn't explain how certain stones fit together so perfectly, or why some walls never cracked even after decades of harsh winters, whispers began to spread. These women, they said, must have made deals with darker forces. After all, how else could mere females master the sacred art of turning raw stone into unbreakable fortresses? But here's where it gets fascinating. While the church was pointing fingers and crying heresy, the very nobles who funded these religious institutions were secretly seeking out these mysterious builders. Why? Because their castles simply didn't fall. When rival armies attacked, when earthquakes shook the land, when time itself tried to wear down the stones, these structures stood firm. The nobles called it the art of stones that never fall, and they were willing to pay enormous sums for it, even if it meant dealing with women the church branded as dangerous. Let me tell you about one woman whose story survived the centuries. Her name was Alais, and she was known simply as the Stone Carver. Picture a young widow in 12th century France, her husband killed in some forgotten war, left with nothing but her skills and an iron determination to survive. While other widows might have retreated to convents or depended on family charity, Alais picked up her tools and walked straight into the most ambitious construction project of her time, the great Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Now, Notre Dame wasn't just any building project. This was going to be a monument to God himself, a structure so magnificent that pilgrims would travel from across Europe just to stand in its shadow. The master builders were the most respected men in France, and they certainly didn't expect to find a woman among their ranks. But Alais had something they needed: an almost mystical understanding of how stone wanted to be shaped. She specialized in gargoyles, those grotesque creatures that perch on cathedral walls like stone guardians. But Allay's gargoyles were different. While other carvers created standard demons and monsters, she crafted creatures that seemed almost alive, their eyes following you as you walked past, their expressions changing with the light. People said her gargoyles actually protected the cathedral, that rain fell more gently and storms passed more quickly because of her stone sentinels. And here's the detail that gives me chills every time I think about it. Allay had a signature, a way of marking her work that wouldn't be discovered until centuries later. Hidden among the snarling faces and twisted bodies of her gargoyles, she carved tiny wolves. Not obvious ones that anyone would notice, but subtle shapes worked into the stone folds and shadows. Each wolf was unique, and together they formed a kind of secret gallery, a quiet declaration that said, "I was here, I made this, and my work will outlast kingdoms." When restoration work began on Notre Dame in the 1800s, workers started finding these wolf signatures everywhere. Not just on gargoyles, but carved into internal support beams, worked into decorative columns, even etched into foundation stones that no one was supposed to see. It was as if Allay had left a trail of breadcrumbs through the cathedral, a hidden map of her contributions to one of history's greatest architectural achievements. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Those wolves weren't just decorative. They were placed at structurally critical points. Modern engineers studying the cathedral have found that many of Allay's wolf markers correspond exactly to load-bearing joints and stress points that wouldn't be fully understood until the development of modern architectural science. It's as if she possessed an intuitive knowledge of how forces moved through stone that was centuries ahead of her time. This combination of artistic skill and engineering genius was exactly what made women like Allay so valuable to their clients and so terrifying to the authorities. They weren't just following established patterns or copying traditional designs. They were innovating, experimenting, pushing the boundaries of what stone construction could achieve. And when your innovations seem impossible to explain with the science of your era, people start looking for other explanations. The tragedy is that we almost lost these stories entirely. As the centuries passed and the fear of witchcraft grew stronger, records were destroyed, names were erased, and the contributions of women like Allay were deliberately forgotten. If not for those tiny stone wolves and a handful of documents that escaped the flames, we might never have known that some of Europe's greatest architectural achievements were shaped by hands that history tried to erase. But success, as history teaches us, often carries the seeds of its own destruction. As word spread about these remarkable fortresses that seemed to defy the very laws of warfare, something darker began to brew in the courts and churches of medieval Europe. Imagine being a nobleman who had just spent a fortune hiring the best male architects and engineers available, only to watch your supposedly impregnable castle crumble under the first serious siege. Now picture your neighbor's fortress, the one built by those mysterious women everyone whispers about, standing tall and unbroken after withstanding months of assault. The stones don't even show cracks. The walls look as fresh as the day they were completed. How would that make you feel? Proud of your neighbor's success? Happy that superior craftsmanship had triumphed? If you're thinking those thoughts, you're probably a better person than most medieval nobles. Because what actually happened was far more human and far more tragic. Envy is a poison that works slowly, but surely. At first, it was just murmured conversations in castle halls. Why did some fortifications seem blessed while others fell like houses of cards? How was it possible that structures built by women who everyone knew were the weaker sex, could outlast the mightiest works of acclaimed male masters? The church, already suspicious of any woman who wielded knowledge that seemed beyond the natural order, began to pay closer attention. Priests started visiting construction sites, asking pointed questions about techniques and methods. They examined tools, interrogated workers, and searched for any sign of unholy practices. When they couldn't find concrete evidence of witchcraft, they began to argue that the very success of these structures was proof enough of supernatural interference. This is where our story takes a heartbreaking turn, because it involves a woman who should have been a hero, but became something far more complicated. Her name was Madame de Montfort, and she was one of the most powerful noblewomen in 13th century France. She controlled vast territories, commanded armies, and had the respect of kings. More importantly for our story, she was also one of the few nobles who openly employed and protected female architects and builders. Madame de Montfort was no ordinary patron. She didn't just hire these women, she defended them. When local priests complained about unnatural building methods, she reminded them that her castles protected pilgrims and served God's will. When rival nobles questioned her choices, she invited them to test the strength of her fortifications. She created what we might call today a safe space, a place where women could practice their craft without fear of persecution. Under her protection, female builders flourished like never before. They developed new techniques for mixing mortar that seemed to make stones bond like they were alive. They designed defensive features that confused attackers and channeled siege engines into vulnerable positions. Most remarkably, they created structures that seemed to adapt to threats, almost as if the buildings themselves were learning from each assault. For nearly 2 decades, this arrangement worked beautifully. Madame de Montfort's territories became known for having the finest fortifications in Europe. Merchants traveled her roads knowing they were protected by unbreachable strongholds. Her subjects prospered in safety. The women under her protection passed their knowledge to apprentices, creating what historians now believe was the most sophisticated school of military architecture in the medieval world. But then politics intervened, as politics always does. The King of France, Louis, had been watching Madame de Montfort's success with growing concern. Her territories were becoming too prosperous, too independent, too secure. Worse, her methods were spreading. Other nobles were beginning to quietly employ female builders, and the traditional guilds of male craftsmen were losing influence and income. This represented a fundamental threat to the established order. In 1243, Louis sent Madame de Montfort an ultimatum disguised as a friendly request. He suggested that she might want to reconsider her employment practices, particularly regarding certain women whose methods had attracted unwelcome attention from church authorities. The message was clear: conform or face the consequences. Here's where our hero reveals her tragic flaw. Faced with the choice between protecting the women who had made her fortune and preserving her own power, Madame de Montfort chose herself. She didn't make this decision overnight. Surviving documents suggest she agonized over it for months. But in the end, self-preservation won over loyalty. The betrayal was swift and brutal. In a single night, royal guards arrested every female builder in Madame de Montfort's territories. Some were imprisoned, others were tried for witchcraft, and a few simply disappeared entirely. The woman who had once been their greatest protector now provided testimony about their allegedly unnatural abilities, painting their skills as evidence of diabolic pacts rather than human genius. But here's where our story takes an unexpected turn that connects medieval France to the frozen steppes of Russia. Some of these women had seen the writing on the wall before the arrests began. They had noticed the increasing scrutiny, felt the changing political winds, and made preparations that would prove remarkably prescient. Hidden in the private papers of a merchant family from Reims, historians have discovered diary entries that read like a medieval thriller. They describe secret meetings held in abandoned monasteries, coded messages passed between female builders across different regions, and most intriguingly, detailed architectural plans being smuggled eastward along trade routes. The diary entries mention a group of women who called themselves the Stone Sisters, making a desperate journey toward the lands of the Rus, carrying with them not just their lives, but their knowledge. They took detailed drawings of fortification designs, notes on advanced construction techniques, and most importantly, the accumulated wisdom of generations of female builders. Now, this is where the story becomes almost too incredible to believe, except that the evidence is literally built in stone. When construction began on what would eventually become the Moscow Kremlin in the 14th century, the architects employed building techniques that were remarkably similar to those used in the lost castles of medieval France. The distinctive way of joining massive stone blocks, the innovative approach to creating defensive angles, even the method of mixing mortar, All bore striking resemblances to the work of the persecuted female builders who had fled westward generations earlier. Recent archaeological analysis of the Kremlin's oldest foundations has revealed tool marks that match implements known to have been used exclusively by medieval female guilds. The spacing of chisel strikes, the angle of cuts, even the mathematical precision of measurements all point to construction methods that originated not in Russia, but in the workshops of 13th century French stoneworkers. It's as if these women, driven from their homeland by fear and persecution, carried their secrets across thousands of miles and centuries to help create one of history's most iconic fortresses. Their knowledge, rejected and condemned in the West, found new life in the East where different political structures allowed innovation to flourish. And here's something that might blow your mind. If you visit Montségur Castle in southern France today and look closely at the stonework, you'll find tool marks that don't match any known male guild patterns from the medieval period. The spacing is different, the technique is more refined, and the precision suggests tools designed for smaller hands but wielded with extraordinary skill. These marks are found only in the castle's strongest sections, the parts that have survived centuries of weather, warfare, and time itself. So tell me, who do you think really built these castles that still stand today? Was it the men whose names fill the history books, or the women whose signatures remain hidden in stone, waiting for us to notice and remember? If you're enjoying this, like, share, and comment. Who do you think really built the castles? Sometimes the most powerful truths hide in plain sight, waiting centuries for someone to notice the patterns that connect past and present. And nowhere is this more evident than in a small chapel in Scotland that holds secrets linking medieval builders to mysteries that continue to puzzle us today. Rosslyn Chapel sits in the Scottish countryside like a stone riddle, wrapped in an architectural enigma. Built in the mid-1500s by the Sinclair family, it's famous for its incredibly intricate carvings and the legends that surround it. Tourists come from around the world to see the supposed connections to the Knights Templar, the Holy Grail, and a dozen other historical mysteries. But there's something in those ancient stones that most visitors walk right past without realizing its significance. Let me paint you a picture of what researchers discovered when they started comparing the chapel's stained glass windows to medieval manuscripts from across Europe. The windows themselves are relatively modern replacements, but they follow patterns carved into the stone that date back to the original construction. And those patterns tell a story that reaches back through centuries to connect with our tale of the lost female builders. Hidden among the chapel's elaborate decorations are symbols that appear nowhere else in traditional Scottish architecture. We're talking about geometric patterns that seem almost mathematical in their precision, botanical designs that show plants in ways that wouldn't be scientifically understood until much later, and most intriguingly, architectural symbols that match drawings found in manuscripts attributed to the women we've been calling the witch builders. Now, here's where this gets really fascinating. In the late 1990s, a scholar studying medieval construction techniques was comparing various historical documents when she noticed something extraordinary. The margin notes in a 13th century building manual contained sketches of symbols that were virtually identical to decorative elements in Rosslyn Chapel. This manual, discovered in a French monastery, had long been attributed to an anonymous group the monks referred to as the Learned Women, or in their Latin, Mulieres Doctae. But the connections go deeper than just matching symbols. The mathematical relationships between different architectural elements in Rosslyn Chapel follow principles that weren't supposed to be widely understood until the Renaissance. The way weight is distributed, how light flows through the interior, even the acoustic properties that make whispers carry from one specific point to another. All of this suggests knowledge that was far advanced for its time. When you start looking at the construction techniques used in Rosslyn Chapel, you find tool marks and joining methods that echo the work we discussed earlier. The precision of the stone cutting, the innovative approaches to supporting massive decorative elements, even the way the builders solved problems that shouldn't have had solutions yet. It all points to knowledge that had been passed down through generations of craftspeople who operated outside the official historical record. Think about what this means. Here we have a building constructed in the 1500s that incorporates design principles and symbols from manuscripts created by persecuted women builders 2 centuries earlier. It's as if the knowledge these women possessed didn't just survive their persecution. It found ways to influence architecture across different countries and cultures, leaving traces of their genius embedded in stone and glass for future generations to discover. But here's what really gets me thinking about all of this. Why are we still surprised when women excel in fields like engineering and architecture today? Why does it still make headlines when a woman designs a skyscraper or leads a major construction project? We act as if women entering these fields is some revolutionary new development, when the evidence suggests they've been contributing to monumental construction for over 1,000 years. Walk through any major engineering school today, and you'll find that women make up about 20% of the students. That number has been slowly climbing for decades, but it's still shockingly low when you consider that half the population possesses the same capacity for spatial reasoning, mathematical thinking, and creative problem-solving that these fields require. We treat women in engineering like they're anomalies, when history suggests they should be recognized as part of a tradition that stretches back to the cathedral builders of medieval Europe. The parallels are striking when you think about it. Medieval women builders faced accusations of witchcraft when their work seemed too advanced for contemporary understanding. Today, women in male-dominated technical fields often face subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions that their success must be due to factors other than pure competence. The language has changed, but the underlying skepticism remains remarkably similar. Consider the story of Emily Warren Roebling, who essentially took over construction of the Brooklyn Bridge in the 1800s when her husband became ill. She supervised the day-to-day construction, dealt with suppliers and contractors, and solved engineering problems that had stumped male experts. Yet for decades, history books barely mentioned her contributions. She was literally overseeing one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 19th century. But somehow, that didn't fit the narrative of what women were supposed to be capable of accomplishing. Or think about Zaha Hadid, the first woman to win the Pritzker Architecture Prize, whose futuristic designs were once dismissed as unbuildable fantasies. When computer technology finally advanced enough to make her visions reality, those same critics who had called her work impossible suddenly discovered it was brilliant. The knowledge was always there. It just took the world time to catch up to her understanding of what architecture could become. This pattern repeats throughout history. Women develop innovative solutions to complex technical problems, face skepticism, or outright hostility from established authorities, and then watch as their contributions are either forgotten or attributed to others. The medieval women builders, the anonymous architects whose symbols survive in places like Rosslyn Chapel, the modern engineers who still have to prove themselves in ways their male colleagues never do, they're all part of the same continuous story. What strikes me most about the Rosslyn Chapel connection is how it suggests that knowledge finds a way to survive, even when the people who created it are erased from official history. Those symbols carved in stone, those mathematical relationships built into the architecture, those innovative construction techniques, they're all evidence that human creativity and intelligence can't be completely suppressed, no matter how hard societies try to limit who gets to contribute to our greatest achievements. The women who built castles and cathedrals in medieval Europe may have had their names forgotten and their stories suppressed, but their legacy lives on in every woman who picks up a blueprint today, in every female engineer who solves a problem that seemed impossible, in every architect who dares to imagine structures that push the boundaries of what's been done before. The shadows these women cast are long ones, reaching across centuries to remind us that the capacity for building, creating, and innovating has never been limited by gender, only by opportunity and recognition. And maybe, just maybe, if we pay attention to the patterns hidden in our history, we can finally start giving credit where credit has always been due. So here we are, at the end of a story that spans centuries but feels as relevant today as it did when the first stone was laid by hands that history tried to forget. These women, architects, engineers, innovators, builders, they never needed magic wands or supernatural powers. Their magic was far more real and far more lasting than any spell ever could be. Their magic lived in the steady precision of the chisel, as it shaped raw stone into something that would outlast empires. It flowed through the careful calculations on their measuring instruments, those medieval rulers and compasses that helped them turn mathematical dreams into physical reality. But perhaps most powerfully, their magic resided in something that no tool could provide: the extraordinary courage it took to defy a world that would rather see them silenced than celebrated. Think about what that meant in practical terms. These women woke up every morning knowing that their very success made them targets. They understood that if their castles stood too strong, if their innovations seemed too advanced, if their knowledge appeared too profound, they would face accusations that could end in flames. Yet they kept building. They kept creating. They kept pushing the boundaries of what was possible because they believed their work mattered more than their safety. And you know what? They were absolutely right. Walk through Europe today, and you're walking among their monuments. Those cathedral spires reaching toward heaven, those castle walls that have weathered 1,000 storms, those architectural marvels that still make modern engineers scratch their heads in wonder. They're all testaments to the genius of women whose names we may never know, but whose legacy surrounds us everywhere we look. The stones remember, even when the history books forget. Every perfectly fitted joint, every wall that has stood for 800 years, every innovative solution to an impossible engineering problem. They're all shouting the same message across the centuries. We were here. We built this. And no amount of erasure can change the fact that our work endures. But here's the question that keeps me awake at night, and it's one I want to leave with you. If we can forget contributions this massive, this fundamental to the world we live in, what other stories are we missing? What other innovations, what other achievements, what other brilliant minds have been written out of history? Because they didn't fit the narrative that those in power wanted to tell. The women who built Europe's greatest fortresses faced a choice that resonates through every generation. They could play it safe, stay invisible, work within the narrow confines that society had drawn for them, or they could risk everything to leave something behind that mattered. Something that would outlast their own lives and speak to future generations about what human creativity could accomplish when it refused to be contained. They chose to build. They chose to create. They chose to leave a legacy written in stone and mortar and mathematical precision. Their castles are still standing today, silent witnesses to the fact that true achievement doesn't need official recognition to change the world. So what about you? What are you building with your life? What legacy are you creating that will outlast the temporary opinions of people who might not understand your vision? Are you going to let others write your story? Or are you going to carve it into something so permanent, so undeniably real, that future generations will have no choice but to recognize what you accomplished? The witch builders of medieval Europe didn't have social media or YouTube channels or any of the platforms we use today to share our stories. But they found a way to make their voices heard across 8 centuries. They built their messages into the very foundations of European civilization. And now, finally, we're learning to read what they wrote. Their magic wasn't supernatural. It was the very human magic of refusing to be erased, of creating something so beautiful and so enduring that it would eventually force the world to acknowledge their genius. That's the kind of magic available to all of us, if we have the courage to reach for it. If this story has sparked something in you, if you're curious to discover more hidden chapters of history that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past, then make sure to hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their contributions matter, that their voice deserves to be heard, that their work can outlast any attempt to silence it. And don't forget to subscribe to the Medieval Archives, where we're dedicated to uncovering the lost stories that shaped our world. From forgotten inventors to erased artists, from anonymous architects to invisible innovators, we're bringing these buried truths back into the light where they belong. Because here's what I believe with every fiber of my being: every story matters, every contribution counts, and every person who has ever created something meaningful deserves to be remembered. The women who built these castles would have loved to know that centuries later, people like you would still be curious about their lives, still amazed by their achievements, still inspired by their courage. So until our next journey into the hidden corridors of history, keep questioning the official stories, keep looking for the voices that have been silenced, and keep building something that will make future generations glad you were here. The past is full of mysteries waiting to be solved, and trust me, we've only just begun to scratch the surface.